Shogun is arguably the most popular show on television right now, but I remember when you could rent it at the video store in a 4 VHS set. Well, the 1980 miniseries, of course. And I just knew if there was a video with multiple cassettes, it had to be fire. The Stand, Titanic, The Godfather, you knew you were in for a good time. So I decided to go back and take a look at this epic 10-hour miniseries that aired on NBC in 1980, and see just how different it is from its 2024 counterpart. Now, if you're looking for a more in-depth dive on the new version, be sure to check out my ending explained, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Now get ready to dance, I think you'll be surprised at some of these differences. The first thing you'll notice is the aspect ratio with these black bars on the side. That's because the miniseries was originally meant to air on the square televisions of the 1980s, whereas the 2024 version has that glorious widescreen we've all come to know and love. Taking the place of CGI, we have miniatures, like the one used to depict the Erasmus as it nearly crashes into the shores of Japan. Crew members fall into the sea and perish as Captain John Blackthorne is knocked unconscious, waking up in a comfortable home. There's even that funny scene where he knocks his fist through the wall. This is certainly a different reception than John receives in the modern version, as he and his crewmates are immediately subject to interrogation and some even boiled to death. That happens in the 80s, but a little bit later. There's even this particularly terrifying scene where the men, under the order of Yabashigi, must vote on one of them to be killed. This is to set an example and keep the men in order. Arguably, one of the biggest differences between the two versions are that there are no English subtitles in the 80s. You heard that right, every time someone speaks Japanese, it's not translated. This is incredibly frustrating at first, especially after watching the 2024 version, but producers made this decision to make the viewer feel like John Blackthorne, a stranger trying to comprehend this new world. This means that almost every scene between two people talking in Japanese is cut and replaced with English speakers like John, Rodriguez, Catholic priests, or translators, all of whom have significantly larger roles. In the 2024 version, the Erasmus's captain commits suicide before landing, yet in the 80s he makes it ashore, only to die a few days later. The character Yabashigi's name has also been shortened to just Yabu, probably to make it easier for Western audiences to remember. When John resists his captivity, members of his crew are brought out to be boiled until he behaves. The 80s version also includes narration littered throughout, like when Lord Toranaga's ship first arrives on the shores of Anjiro. And can you guess who does the narration?
The galley that was rounding the headland depended on neither wind nor tide.
That's none other than Orson Welles, and these excerpts provide much needed context since we don't have the luxury of translation. In the 80s version, you definitely know who the bad guys are by the music. In 2024, John is tied up like a prisoner, but here he's given free rein, even allowed to steer the boat. The harrowing scene in which Yabu attempts to save Rodriguez from the side of a cliff actually happens in the middle of the ocean in the 80s version. I'm sure this is partly due to technical restraints of the time, but just check out the difference in depictions of Osaka in both versions. Obviously, they didn't have the computer graphics to flesh out the scope of the city. In the 80s version, we don't even meet Lord Toranaga until an hour and 45 minutes into the first episode. In 2024, it's just 8. Here we see him with his falcon indoors as opposed to outdoors. You may have also noticed that the Christian priests wear orange instead of black. I actually spent a bit of time trying to figure out why that was, but couldn't come up with an answer, so if any of you know, I'd love to hear the reason in the comments. When John is taken prisoner after his meeting with Toranaga, we see all sorts of men strung up on crosses, something we don't see in the modern version. His prison cell is a lot more cramped and disease-ridden, with dead bodies being pulled out due to malnutrition. In the 2024 version, the interactions between John and Father Domingo last only about 6 minutes, while in the 80s it's almost 25. When you don't have Japanese translation, you gotta pad that runtime somehow. The assassination attempt of John is very different in both versions. I actually prefer the modern version, where a female maid hiding under cover for years is this assassin. The reason she fails is due to Toranaga's cunning. The day before, Toranaga switched rooms with John, making his location the night of the assassination attempt different. One thing I thought was pretty hilarious were how the Japanese maids treat John. In the modern version, he's this smelly barbarian everyone is afraid of and no one wants to touch him, whereas in the 80s the girls giggle around him, are more than happy to bathe him, and even give him massages. There's also this hilarious scene where John teaches Toranaga how to dance.
You well, oh you Barbary merchant. Fare thee well to the Spanish blockade.
It definitely wouldn't fit the tone of the modern version, but it's a pretty fun bonding moment for the two of them. This dancing also ties into how John distracts Lord Ishido from discovering Toranaga's escape from Osaka Castle. He does this mad dance distracting the palace guards. In the modern version, John goes irate when a guard threatens to search the women's carriages and disrespects their decency. Lord Ishido himself does the actual inspection in the 80s version, while in 2024 it's one of his guards. During the attack on Toranaga's caravan, Buntaro, Mariko's husband, makes this epic final stand to hold off their escape, but we never see this in the 80s version. In fact, Father Del Aqua is on the black ship and orders that no one will be killed.
While I am here, there will be no killing.
John's escape aboard Toranaga's ship in the modern version has him racing against the black ship, narrowly missing the rocky shores. However, in the 80s versions, they ram their way through the blockade using dozens of muskets. In order to get around the lack of translation, Orson Welles actually narrates Toranaga's entire speech to his army.
Together, we will prevail.
When John is made Hatamoto to Lord Toranaga and arrives back in Injiro, Yabu tells the villagers it is their responsibility to teach John their customs and language, and if John doesn't know enough Japanese in 6 months, every villager will be killed. John hates this so much that he threatens to commit suicide unless Yabu rescinds this order.
I will have to commit suicide at once.
And he almost does it, putting the knife close to his chest before Omi stops him. A similar scene happens in 2024, but for different reasons. In the modern version, we have this brutal scene where Usami Fuji's husband and child are killed for disrespecting Toranaga in front of Ishido. We never get to see this in the 80s version, nor Fuji's utter distaste at having to become consort to a white barbarian. The love affair between Mariko and John is nowhere near as complicated as it is in the modern version. Basically, John falls in love with her and flat out asks her,
I wish you were to be my consort.
Which of course she can't do because she's married to Buntaro, but literally 10 minutes later she's disrobing in front of him in the bath.
In Japan, Anjin-san, we have no shame of our bodies.
They pillow together and the next day this man is swooning.
Thou art beautiful, and I love thee.
Something you'd never catch 2024 John saying. John goes so far as to ask Toranaga to dissolve Mariko and Buntaro's marriage so that he can marry her, something Toranaga doesn't take too kindly. In the 2024 version, John is already married and has 2 kids back home, something that is never mentioned in the 1980s. In the modern version, the pheasant is a gift from Toranaga, but in the 80s it's a gift from his consort Fujisama. When Mariko's husband Buntaro arrives back in town, he and John drink themselves silly, with Buntaro showing off his bow and arrow skills. It's far more harrowing in the modern version where Buntaro fires these arrows past his wife. John's gardener Ujiro is killed after burying this pheasant. We never see the actual killing in the modern version, but we do in the 80s, and John goes a little off the handle.
You murdering bitch!
I gotta say there's something quite charming about the practical effects used for the earthquake in the 80s version. We watch as soldiers, including Toranaga himself, get sucked into these massive fissures. Desperate for aid in his fight against Ishido, Toranaga enlists the help of his brother. In the modern version, this sets up his eventual betrayal, providing a nice twist for those unfamiliar with the story. In the 80s version, there is no such betrayal as Toranaga's brother arrives already having sided with Ishido. One of the biggest character omissions in the 1980s version is that of Toranaga's son, Nagakado. Surprisingly, this doesn't have much of an impact on the overall story. Our characters still end up imprisoned in Osaka for the final act of the story. In the 1980 version, Mariko's seppuku is held outdoors with various members of the court in attendance, including Lady Ochiba, and it's not John who ends up seconding her, rather Yabu. But just like the modern version, Mariko is given the permits to leave just before she's killed. The 80s also entirely omits the friendship backstory between Mariko and Ochiba. Now, if you love that scene where Mariko fights off the palace guards as she tries to leave, well, unfortunately that doesn't happen in the 1980s. Neither does the 80s have any flashbacks, but what it does have are terrible wigs and bald caps. It also really doesn't go into that whole gun and cannon stuff, nor does it play a significant role in the story, so we do miss out on that insane scene where Toranaga's son assassinates one of Ishido's emissaries with cannons. If there are any Hiramatsu fans out there, you'll be happy to note that in the 1980 version he doesn't commit seppuku, rather goes on to battle alongside Toranaga in his fight against Ishido. After the blast that kills Mariko, John is blinded for a few weeks until he's taken to Osaka Harbor to return to Anjiro. There he's confronted by the Portuguese Captain Ferreira, who wants to burn him at the stake, but thankfully he's shot with arrows. Rodriguez, portrayed here by the same guy who played Gimli, is given the captaincy of that black ship. In both versions, John arrives back in Anjiro to find his ship sunk, but in the 80s this is all the doing of Toranaga and not Mariko. Toranaga ends up giving Kiku the prostitute's contract to John, really pissing off Omi, who had a crush on her. And this might have something to do with Yabu's betrayal, since Omi is Yabu's nephew. In 2024, Yabu is sentenced to death for his involvement in the death of Mariko, but in the 1980s his death is for killing one of Toranaga's captains. Here it's Hiramatsu who seconds him, not Toranaga. John is allowed to rebuild his ship, but in the 1980 version the money to do so is bequeathed to him from Mariko. In 2024 we learn that war is averted when Lady Ochiba decides not to send her son's army to help Ishido. This isn't the case in the 1980 version. While we don't see any large-scale battle, the story of what happens is told through voiceover. Toranaga ends up defeating Ishido in battle and punishes him by burying his body in the ground with his head sticking out so people could pelt things at him. He survived 3 days before passing. After Toranaga's victory, the boy emperor granted Toranaga the title Shogun. So you'll see in both versions, John's fate is still unknown. I tend to like the 2024 version better, although my judgment may be skewed as I watched it first. But what Shogun do you think reigns supreme, the 1980 or 2024? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and for more bad takes, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at PinkStoryYT. Until next time, remember...